Good morning. This is Kenneth and Heather with the Advancing Equity Coalition, here to break down the amended working MPS budget and basically any information that we currently know. So before we get into it, Heather, how are you doing this morning?
Doing well today, doing well.
Good, good to hear it. Um, so yeah, last week there was a finance committee meeting to really talk about what is the financial position of the district, and coming up with the new budget, especially after the new contracts were signed with the Minneapolis Federation of Teachers and the Educational Support Professional Unions. And so we started to see a little bit of information and how the district is now going to be planning their new budget. And so yesterday, if you didn't see it, we published the top 3 things that you should know about the new budgeting cycle. And so what we know from this at this point right now is that Minneapolis Public Schools is facing now an $86.2 million budget gap, that a large portion will be covered by the America Rescue Plan dollars that the federal government sent to Minneapolis Public Schools as a result of COVID. And then also some of the district's fund balance or their like emergency savings account. And we'll talk about that more in a second. So since a large portion of that was covered, of the 86 million was covered by those 2 pots of money for next school year, we know that there will still be $27.1 million of cutting that the district will need to do from this current year's budget. And so that is a lot. And those cuts are going to happen from Davis Center and the schools. We know that also that since the beginning of the school year, the district has lost over 750 students. And so because of this declining enrollment and another anticipated 500 students leaving the district next year, there's another big reason for cuts. The district said there's about $6 to $10 million worth of lost revenue because of that number of students leaving the district. And then finally, we know that the district central office, Davis Center, is going to take an $8 million cut from their departments. And so if $8 million are covered at central office, that means $19 million are going to be spent. Those cuts are going to be spread across the over 70 school sites that we have in Minneapolis Public Schools. So a lot of information came out during the finance committee meeting. And since it's not usually a meeting we cover, and it's not usually something that's paid super close attention to, we thought it'd be important to have this discussion and just kind of discuss the implications of the new budgeting cycle for Minneapolis Public Schools right now.
Yeah, so it's important to know that your school's principal is probably either getting some adjusted enrollment numbers, in which are going to cause them to sort of have to think about a reduction in staff, or they might be getting some different costing for ESPs and teachers that might have to cause them to make adjustments. So most principals, even though they did that whole long budget tie out process and submitted it and signed, now they're going to have to be making some tweaks and adjustments. So you might be hearing some of those things from your child's school.
Yeah, and I think what's really important to remember is that no school is actually taking classroom teacher cuts because of the new salary increases due to the new contract. It's actually because of declined enrollment that schools are going to have to adjust their budgets. And then any other changes to staff and line items that are being cut because of the increases in the classroom teacher salary and other salary increases, that licensed educators in the building won't be impacted by that. So but that does mean that schools are still going through this process of budget tie-out again, which means they have to reallocate dollars and figure out where they're going to be cutting because of this declined enrollment and because of some of the different changes in the budget. And so, something that we were really fighting for, we didn't get a total win around, but was really important to us, was that the protection for teachers of color were in place this year so that teachers of color would not be cut from their building and cut from the district. Now we know that teachers of color were not protect there were protections in place, but that starts in the next school year. So you might be hearing from us and other folks that protections for teachers of color are in place and no building should lose their teacher of color because of because of the contract and the agreement and all that stuff. But that doesn't start until next year, which is really, really frustrating because we were fighting so hard to get that protection in place this year. But that's not the case. So yes, teachers of color are still vulnerable during this budgeting cycle to be cut from their buildings, which is really unfortunate. And it just didn't need to happen that way, but it did. And here we are.
The other thing to sort of know is that there are a lot of positions in our district that we didn't fill last year. So that's another place that, some of this cost savings will like happened for these budget cuts, is that literally there are so many positions that we didn't ever get to fill, because of overall worker shortage.
Yeah. And so the cost savings from those vacancies actually went to the salaries for teachers this year because as a part of the teacher agreement or the agreements with the unions, those salaries increased, and that was backlogged from this past school year as well. So teachers are going to actually be getting an increased salary for their work this
I
year,
see.
and then we're going to actually still have to figure out how we're paying for their teacher salaries next year, and that's where the $86 million comes into play, and that's where the $27 million worth of cuts has to come into play. So a lot of moving parts.
And I don't really love budgets. I don't really like talking about finance, but I will say that understanding what the fund balance is and does for us as a district is something that I feel like a lot of people are sort of like confused by, or wondering why we have this big savings account while we have these big shortages, and why can't we just spend that. So let's just talk about, like, what is the fund balance and why do we have to have it, and why does it have to be the size that it is?
Yeah, so the fund balance is like a really important mechanism because, like you mentioned, it's essentially the district's savings account. So if it's the emergency fund, it's the rainy day fund, right? And so if something were to happen in the district that was unplanned, that would impact either that the district would need to scramble and pull money together really quick for, or if they would have to um, yeah, they just need to figure out a way to like keep money coming into the district. They
Like a
have
government shutdown or a state shutdown, something like
exactly.
that.
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. Then the district has to use their fund balance in order to continue to pay staff if for the time that the government is shut down. And so the fund balance is a really important mechanism. So yeah, imagine if your source of income all of a sudden went away. Hopefully, you have a strong savings account in place so that you have a little cushion while you try to find a new job. That's what the fund balance is for. Another reason is if, let's say, a school started on fire, a roof caved in a building, you need your fund balance in place. You need some liquid assets so that you can pay to have the roof repaired. You can pay to, relocate students into another building while repairs are being made to, to the building that was set on fire or whatever, right? Like those are really important and tangible reasons why our fund balance is so important. And so the fund balance has to be at, like, I believe the district's policy, and I could be wrong, and I'm sure there are people in the internet that will correct me. I believe the district's fund balance has to be 8 to 13% of the district's total budget. And so that means that the district has to at least have 8% of their total budget in their fund balance. And that's also a really important level as well because it actually dictates the amount of money, like the type of bond rating that we have. And bond rating, I'm not going to lie to you all, I don't totally understand bond ratings and how that all works, but our bond rating does allow us to take on loans and take on debt and be in good standing with creditors, is my understanding of it. So when we want to make additions or when we want to have capital improvements to different buildings, that bond rating is super important. And one of the factors of our bond rating is how healthy is our emergency bank account, because that is a sign of fiscal health for the district. And so there was a lot of conversation, chatter around like, why can't we just pay why can't we use the fund balance just to pay teachers the 5% increase, the 10% increase, the 15% increase that they wanted? The issue is like we shouldn't be working to spend down our our um our fund balance, right? Our savings account. And the reason why the district is spending some of their fund balance right now is because there was a strike that took place for 3 weeks. That was an emergency. We needed to get families, we needed to get students back in school. We needed to support families. And so what ended up happening is the district was able to use one-time funds from their fund balance and pay the teachers the bonuses out of that money that they were supposed to receive. And so as long as it's a one-time expenditure, you can rebuild that. But if it's an ongoing thing where you have to pay teachers, staff a 10% increase, a 5% increase, a 2% increase out of the fund balance, that's not actually good financial stewardship. That's not good use of taxpayer dollars when that bond rating is so important for, again, the random emergency that you have to attend to, and also when creditors are looking at our bond rating and are looking um at our like fund balance health. So just a couple of things to note. And a lot, again, I think there's a lot of misinformation about the fund balance and its use during the strike. And I think it's important that people understand what the fund balance really is. It's your emergency bank account.
Yeah, the other conversation that we've heard a lot about. So, and thank you for that. The other conversation we've heard a lot about is like we use too much in administration costs. We use too much money at the Davis Center or like our central center, and so like everything should be going into schools. And that's another conversation that I think we need a lot of understanding around. And so, well, as a former classroom teacher, it is important that you see the money going into classrooms. And I do think that, like, in a district where we really aren't doing well by students of color and Indigenous students, and we lack a certain degree of accountability for that, I do think there is a sense of like we need a group of people to hold us accountable. We also need people, like, I think one of the things that we hear a lot is like, oh, Davis Center has too many people and it's too expensive, right? But then when it's time for communications and there's no communication to families, or there's not real quality family engagement, or transportation, when your kiddo doesn't get home from the bus, and we saw that especially with the transportation shortage of like, you and I, there were people at Davis driving buses. And well, when you have folks driving buses who are supposed to be designing routes, you can see real quickly, oh, that's a very important person. And so I do think there is this tension in our district. And when we talk about like $8 million being cut from Davis, some part of my like former teacher brain is like, yes, that makes sense to me. And then another part of the person who's gone to the board meetings and really tried to understand the power and the way this district works really feels like, oh, I'm a little nervous about that, because I think there's a lot of times when the Davis Center gets blamed for its own shortages. And so what do you think about like $8 million being cut? You've been in the boardroom longer than I have.
Yeah. So I think a couple of things, right? Like, I think the first and foremost thing is I can understand why families would say, like, yeah, cut money at the central office, right? Because, like, if you're saying that the investment in communications, transportation, whatever, is like funding those departments is important, those departments have still struggled in the ways that they're currently operating. So, like, why put any money into those? They're not even really supporting family. Like, so many people have said, you've said, like, you're still getting texts about your kids' transportation, even though you've never signed up for busing and your kids walk to school, right? And so I think that I understand the frustration. At the same time, all of those departments are operating so thinly, and end up making the errors and the mistakes that families and schools feel regularly because we could have continued to cut from Davis Center. We
Hmm.
continue to say like, oh, we think this department can operate at half capacity. We think we think the communications department can operate at half capacity. When the community is complaining about no community engagement around several different things, that's because we cut from the community engagement department. That's because we can cut from parent participatory evaluators, right? Like those are real things that we keep cutting from, and it doesn't service anyone at the end of the day, because I think the other thing that folks forget is that like while those dollars aren't in the classroom tangibly supporting students, those are really important support services for schools. Now, if those schools don't value the way that that support is happening, that's a very, very real conversation to have. But when we start cutting from Davis Center, the schools that are also going to be most disproportionately impacted are our like Title I schools,
That's right.
our lower income schools, our racially identifiable schools, because a lot of those supports are supposed to be going to that group of schools. And so it's if a non-Title I school wants to, complain and say, hey, cut from Davis Center so that my kid doesn't take a cut, well, that's their choice. But then it's not that they're just taking away from Davis Center, they're taking away support services from other schools. The final thing that I will say is think about it as like when we have this conversation about voting rights in our country, right? Like elections are operated by at the state level. They're actually not operated at a nationwide level, right? Like it is the responsibility of an individual state to run your election. But we still are asking for a federal voting rights act because we know that states are doing really bad things to leave voters out, to disenfranchise voters, right? When we had a clean voting rights act, some of that stuff got cleaned up, some of that stuff was more closely monitored, and some of that stuff was stopped. Now that that voting rights act has expired, we're seeing more voter disenfranchisement, more people turned away from the polls, all kinds of stuff. That is the same idea with central office in Minneapolis Public Schools and our schools. Our schools are the states. And so if there is no oversight at the district level around if schools are supposed to be doing what they need to be doing, like that's a really, really problematic thing because if no one's looking, people are going to get away with stuff that shouldn't be happening and parents of color are already complaining about. And part of the reason is that, the central office isn't always doing what they're supposed to be doing. But another part of the reason is because we keep cutting from Davis. And so they're going to take an $8 million cut. I honestly don't know if that's good or bad. It is what it is, right? What we should be paying really close, it shouldn't just be like, yes, Davis is taking this cut. We should be paying very, very close attention to where those cuts are coming from outside at Davis so that our special education students don't take a huge impact in the services that they are receiving. Our homeless and highly mobile students don't take a huge impact in the type of services that they're receiving. That transportation is done well, that communication is done well, so that we can, still engage our community or grow the amount of community engagement that's currently happening. Like these are real things that constantly get cut. The Office of Black Male Student Achievement is based out of Davis Center, right? Like so there are real things at Davis that people appreciate and need. And I think it is important that we pay really close attention to where those $8 million are going to get cut from and how we're going to make sure that those cuts stay away from our most vulnerable students, which include our students of color, our students who qualify for free and reduced price lunch, our students who use English language learner services, special education services, right? Like those are the groups of students who are most vulnerable when cuts come out of Davis Center. And so I think it's important that we just closely monitor that. And we have to remember that this district, this board made a commitment to families of color and indigenous families and students around the type of education that they would receive. And this is the type of decision where that commitment has to be centered.
That's
It
right.
can't just be a strategic plan was approved over here and we're making a budget decision here.
That's right.
Like this commitment has to be centered as you're having discussions around where you're willing to take cuts, where you're willing to make cuts from. And so that's where I'll leave that.
Yeah, I mean, and I just like you kind of mentioned it, but like one of the things to think about is like transportation, right? When students are homeless and highly mobile, transportation has to be there in order to make sure that those students get to go to the same building and have this least disruption to their lives as possible, while so many other parts of their lives are swirling. That's a prime example of like, and by the way, as much as I get frustrated with getting the same robocall every Friday, if my family is getting that robocall and they're not fixing that because they're prioritizing making sure that those students get those taxis and cabs and get that stability, I'm for that, right? I think it's important to remember we are within a finite system that's really suffering financially. We are not going to be able to do all the things. And so, but like those are the kinds of things that people at Davis Center do that I think we need to just like remember and sort of like clear the air a little bit and think like I think there's been a very real sense of like we're on different sides of things, and I really feel like what you say is like we need to be student centered in these moments and really think about like who's going to suffer the most, who's going to pay the highest price, and how do we as a city and as a community who wants to do better uphold and support a board in meeting that commitment that they made to us. um
Yeah, I want to be really clear, right? Like I do not think that the Davis Center has is like always done things right and is
no.
always providing the adequate support that schools need. Don't get me wrong, that's not what I'm saying. But taking away the resources from like taking away all $27 million from Davis. First of all, you couldn't because I think there's only $18 million in Davis. But that being said, like even if you did that, like that would disproportionately impact our most vulnerable communities and our most
Yep.
vulnerable students, right? And so, just saying like, yeah, take it from Davis actually hurts our students more than like evenly distributing it across all of our schools or equitably distributing it, and it should be equitably distributed um, across our schools so that we know that our students with the highest populations of students of color, highest populations of students who utilize ELL services, special education services, like those should be the schools where we're preserving our investment in them. This district is preserving their investment in them, and not, you know, yeah. So that is what I will say. It's a really, really hard conversation. Look, Minneapolis Public Schools is in for a really difficult set of decisions time and time and time again. There's a lot of people that are now engaged in the conversation around education, and I hope that they stay engaged in that conversation, but with the lens of justice, equity, and sustainability. Because honestly, like if this district doesn't stay sustainable, again, it's going to be our most vulnerable students who are negatively impacted. And again, this district needs to do much, much, much better by them to begin with, but taking away the investment from them doesn't actually help anything. So that's where we're at. Um,
Complicated conversations where we need to stay away from binaries and really do a lot of both ands.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so with that, I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks, Heather, for engaging in this conversation with me, and talk to you later.
Bye.